afternoon, good evening, one and all. Thank you so much for joining us in this episode of SRE Practitioner Series. I'm your host, Suresh GP, and we are today into episode number 19 of Site Reliability Engineering Practitioner Series. The purpose of this Site Reliability Engineering Practitioner Series is to interview real-world practitioners who are doing some pioneering work in the world of site reliability engineering. So today, we have an esteemed guest, Adriana Villela, a senior developer advocate at ServiceNow, Cloud Observability, formerly LightStep, who's joining in all the way from Toronto to participate in the Practitioner Series. Thank you so much, Adriana, for taking time and sharing your views with our audience today.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited.
Excellent. So for viewers, why don't you give us a view of your experience around different roles that you have played in the years, and what is your fascination towards site reliability engineering, and what has kept you awake in the world of site reliability engineering?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I started my tech life as a developer. Right. And I was actually a developer for 16 years. Java was my jam. And right. I think it was around 2016-ish that I shifted my whole life to DevOps. Mm-hmm. And it was a result of I was managing a team where it was like a release management team. And we were having like the worst time with our releases. All the things went wrong, and it started questioning my life choices. And someone told me, you got to look at DevOps. I'm like, okay, that sounds cool. And it changed my life. And the timing was perfect because the place where I was working, they were standing up a DevOps practice. And so it gave me an opportunity to like build up on the skills that I had built up kind of on the side. I was doing it as a side hustle for my former team, but this time I was getting to do it, actually spreading DevOps practices across the organization and basically getting people excited about it and defining what it meant to follow proper DevOps practices. And for me, I think that was like the perfect marriage for my tech life, because I like coding, but I've always been like really fascinated on the infrastructure side of things. And so this was like the most perfect thing. And so like roles that I've had since then, I worked on a release engineering team, which was more hands-on role where we got to, help teams define like pipelines and whatnot for standardized pipelines. So, to guide them into like the right way of doing things, but still give them some liberty. And then I've also managed a platform engineering team, which was mostly focused around HashiCorp Nomad. And I came from a Kubernetes background. So that was an interesting transition. And then I've managed an observability team as well as part of the same role. So I was managing two teams at the same time. And now I work as a developer advocate with a major focus in OpenTelemetry. And OpenTelemetry is a subset of, what helps make our, or I should say observability is a subset of what helps make our systems reliable. So, it's very near and dear to my heart because we live in a connected world, right? Like software is such a major part of everything that we do. Right. And we are at the point where if an app doesn't work on our phone in a way that we expect it to work, bye-bye, it's gone, right? I'll delete it. We need to, sometimes take a step back and realize there's like humans behind these apps who are working very hard to make sure that these things are up and running and reliable. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that is interesting for me, Adriana, as you started to look at DevOps, a lot of time when I interview site reliability engineering practitioners, they either coming from the infrastructure background, also in terms of operations, stuff like that. So is that a kind of an inclination towards the career path as a logical step from moving from DevOps towards SRE as a developer advocate? Or do you see people switching into the bandwagon of being a site reliability engineering from an infrastructure operations background? Which do you think has been more popular? And is there any kind of way that you have seen your career spinning towards that aspect of site reliability engineering from developer has got a stronger precedence over operations or infrastructure?
I can't say for sure scientifically, but I would hazard a guess that I think a lot of folks who go into like the DevOps space and SRE space and whatnot are coming from like an operations or sysadmin background, because they have an appreciation for like these systems that run our lives, right?
Right.
And so they know the pains. So I think a lot of the times, like when, you know, we've seen like this pivot towards like operations teams rebranded as SREs, but hopefully not just rebranded, but actually like pivoting towards SRE, like people who genuinely have an interest in making sure that our systems are up and running, but also have an affinity for code. And, you know, when I was having an interesting discussion with someone yesterday about how, you know, you would think that because like DevOps practices is all about like codification of the things, and that, you know, flows into SRE, which is like an implementation of DevOps practices. One could argue that because of the codification sort of aspect of it, that more developers would have more of an affinity towards it. But when you think about it, sysadmins have been doing some sort of coding for most of their lives. I mean, bash scripting, that is some form of coding. And now with all these tools at our disposal, it's like, oh, we've got like more mature tools that let us do way cooler things. So yeah, that's why I think there's probably still more like people from an operations and sysadmin background that would venture towards this realm.
Yeah, but yeah, that's true. And there's no one size fits all, and it's a question of understanding whether you're really passionate about it, right? So one question on the same line is, are developers passionate about doing site to lab engineering jobs? Because it's sometimes pretty much on the fire, kind of looking at some of those aspects. And if you're not tuned towards that, I mean, to be fair, the sysadmin and operations have been day in and day out in handling escalations and looking at user experience and being pretty close to the business or end users. So from that particular perspective, is there an affinity for developers to be passionate to go away from their comfort zone of doing coding and, you know, I've been a Java J2E developer, technical architect, I'm done. But, you know, you're on the heat of an escalation of a major incident and stuff like that. Is that a kind of a restrictions of a lot of times people don't think that, you know, it's not appropriate for me to step into that waters. I'd rather be okay to be a developer advocate. So how does that span out in your, as you have interacted with a lot of people?
Yeah, so I would definitely say that our industry has sort of trained our developers to, you know, like, I'm done with the code, it's your problem now, right? And so because of that, we have that kind of ingrained into our culture. And I think one of the things that would be nice, that as I see as a thing that we should aim towards for ensuring like more reliable systems, is making sure that we start seeing more of that practice of developers taking more responsibility for their code, especially when it first goes into production, right? So there isn't that mentality of like, I'm done, I don't care about this thing anymore, it's somebody else's problem. And I think if we do that, it forces developers to be a little bit more mindful, because I think sometimes it's easy to be like, well, it's going to be someone else's problem now. Like there's this thing that's lingering, but whatever, I don't have to worry about that. But when you're putting that kind of onus on them, that responsibility, I think it kind of forces them to be a little more introspective. And I think even kind of forces them to think a little bit more about having observability in their code, right? Because if you're the one who's on the hook for troubleshooting your own code, you better damn well have the information that you need to be able to troubleshoot. But yeah, I mean, because that mentality though is ingrained in our culture of software engineering, I think it can be very difficult to convince folks to have that kind of mentality. But also because you hear all these horror stories of, you know, folks being on call and things being constantly on fire. Who wants to deal with that? I mean, look, there are people who in ops SRE who deal with that sort of thing on a daily basis, but there's only so much that a human can take before they burn out. And so we need to also like address that side of things, right? And I think there's like a lot of companies coming out around incident response, incident management to kind of help to make things better so that our engineers don't burn out.
Absolutely. I think that's a very fair point that I still remember I used to manage large operations for 10 years, and there used to be never a day without escalations. And if there was no escalation, I would say, is everything okay? I didn't have anything on that place. But you're right, because I think as we start to go and push ourselves so much, there's a lot of toil element in the element of the way that they work, and people kind of get mundane routine activities to do that. So there has to be a better way to keep the plight of the operations to do that. So I asked this question to a lot of these infrastructure operations manage support teams. Conversation at how many of you can go peacefully and sleep without having your mobile phones near your bed, right? And
Yeah.
I invariably get everybody say that, you know what, we cannot guarantee a sleep. And this is going back to even the deployments are not right now not being asked to deploy on Fridays because I want to have
Yeah.
a better weekend. So
Yeah.
the organizations are moving towards Thursdays and some other day so that they can actually take time off. So it's all
Yeah.
happening, and it's so much of a hue and cry when it comes to escalations. So I completely agree with what he said. So what are you excited about SRE, right? As a site reliability engineering aspects, what is the aspect that is more fascinating for you in the site reliability engineering space?
I think for me, it's getting to really like, as the name implies, like really focus on reliability and therefore coming up with like different ways of making sure that our systems are running smoothly and making sure that our systems are running smoothly. I think a lot of it involves like codification of as many things as possible, right? And I
Right.
think like one of the huge bottlenecks that we seem to encounter, especially in large enterprises, but I'm sure it afflicts many, big or small, is around security, right?
Right.
Security is important, and you need to have like the security gatekeepers to ensure that there aren't any nefarious attacks on your infrastructure, especially when you're, managing like very sensitive data.
Right.
But then that puts everyone in this weird position of like, security is the gatekeepers, and they don't want to just relinquish control willy-nilly, of course.
Right.
But then they end up becoming a bottleneck of sorts as well, right? Because now you're having to wait on them to like approve various things. So I think one really exciting thing that we are starting to see in the SRE space is policy as code, and to be
Right.
able to codify our policies is such a great thing because we ensure that consistency, we help ensure that reliability, but also then we can add in like a self-service component to it where, it's vetted by our friends in InfoSec.
Right.
So we know that it's, following all the rules it's supposed to. So I really like, that's one thing that really, really excites me.
That's a great point you mentioned about security because I call this like SRE and DevSecOps are like twin sisters because you cannot
Mm-hmm.
do reliability just like on the infrastructure part of it. You need to also look at whether your systems are secured and all with all this attacks and data privacy issues and phishing and malware and ransomware. It's kind of becoming pretty difficult for people to guarantee the reliability of the systems. But also
Mm-hmm.
that part that you looked at saying reliability is an important, are organization prioritizing reliability to a greater extent now? Because as you rightly said, from a user experience standpoint, it's not your server availability, reliability that matters, but it's also about the user experience in terms of your app devices, your application performance monitoring tools. Are we still there in terms of the reliability aspects from a organization standpoint? Are we kind of focusing all our efforts to make that you leave no stone unturned in terms of reliability?
I think organizations are definitely moving in that direction, right? Because we are at a point where we're so reliant on technology for every single aspect of our lives that it's so ubiquitous that I think as consumers, we are very unforgiving when something doesn't go right. I mean, and a lot of organizations have moved to e-commerce and any like sort of any sort of offering along those lines. And so there's definitely like, given that you see a lot of organizations who have like created like SRE teams, SRE organizations, like there's definitely an attempt around that. I think there's still a ways to go in the same way that there's like a lot like we still have a ways to go around DevOps because we haven't quite fulfilled that DevOps promise, right? Of that lowering the barrier between dev and ops. In fact, we've inserted a barrier between dev and ops with DevOps teams.
Right.
So like, but I think the intention is there. The intention is good. And I think the only thing we can do is to keep improving and to bring in folks into organizations who really have like an understanding of what needs to be done and to drive those changes and transformations in the organization, which can be, extremely difficult.
Yeah, true. It's absolutely true. So when we talk about SRE, one of the most common denominator that everybody gets excited about is on the service level objectives. Now, the question is, it's probably a lot more difficult when it comes to service level objectives in a distributed environment that not everything is under your control. So what are some of the tips that you would suggest going on to define the service level objectives? What are some of those do's and don'ts, and basically something that we need to be well aware? Because people think that, okay, you know what, I've been dealing with SLAs for a long period of time. We just replaced the term called SLA with SLO. So people seem to have different perspectives on the value of SLO. So what's your take on SLOs, and what are some of the tips that you would suggest going forward to help organizations build that?
Yeah, totally. And I think that's a really good point, because I think people conflate SLA with SLO, and an SLA is a contractual obligation. So you have to honor that aspect of your contract. And SLO is different because it's basically a target that you want. It's a reliability target of your system based on, some measurements that you're taking, which those measurements being your service level indicators. And the thing about SLOs is that they are not meant to be set in stone, because first of all, when you first set your SLOs, you probably aren't going to get them right.
Correct.
But you have to start somewhere. So you start with something, see if it works. Next time you have an incident, see if the SLO that was supposed to protect you was breached. If it wasn't breached and you still had an incident, well, it's time to like go back to the drawing board. So I think that's the main thing people need to understand, is like, it's going to be a living, breathing thing, and you're not going to get it right the first time. The other thing to do when defining SLOs is to make sure that you're like speaking the same language of time. So normally, like, you define an SLO as you have a target for blah over like a 28-day rolling period. And usually we pick like 28 days instead of like, say, 14 or 30, because you're basically standardizing over a chunk of 4 weeks. So it's easy, like we have like our defined start and stop, right? It's always going to start on it'll be like a Sunday to Sunday. It's not going to be like a Wednesday to Monday kind of thing when your period starts and stops. And so you have like this defined block of time that you're measuring against. And then the other thing is making your SLOs actionable. So making sure that like when an SLO is breached, well, make sure that it's tied to something in your system, like, because there's like an underlying SLI behind that, and which is basically a metric, and making sure that that metric in turn is tied to something else in your system where you can follow those breadcrumbs, so you can go, why is it that this thing is happening, right? Because ultimately that is the goal of observability, is to be able to have that information so you can follow the breadcrumbs to answer the question, why is this happening? And the SLOs can serve as a really great entry point into that. The other thing is to make sure that you focus, there's a lot of focus on these on dashboarding as part of like, your typical operations practice of the olden days. And we want to ditch those dashboards in favor of SLO-based alerts, where the idea is like, if an SLO is breached, then ding, then your developer, your SRE is called, and then they can go in and basically, again, do that digging in, right? Follow those breadcrumbs so that you can answer that question, why is this happening? And then also, I would say SLOs should probably, as much as possible, be treated as a team sport. Because you don't want, like, it shouldn't be the sole responsibility of like an SRE team of an SRE team. I think developers should be involved in that. I think your QA should be involved in that, because these are all the people who make it possible make it possible for your system to run. You should probably even involve some folks like on the business side, right, who give you your business requirements, because they have an understanding of like what reliability means for that system. So those are some of the tips.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you made a great point at the last that you need to have an equal skin in the game, right? It's not just about putting the onus on the site reliability engineers and say that now here is your SLO, it's your baby, kind of go and carry on that, and that's unfair. And to the point that we have consequences using error budgets is also putting people into a spot saying that, you know what, together as a team, be the product owner, the scrum master, the SRE, the operations team, are thinking that we either do it together, right, or fall together, right? So that's a level of spirit of the team sport. I like the way that you portrayed it. It has to be a team sport and not a prerogative of just one person driving that conversations. So as you see site reliability engineering, we'll come back to observability in a bit. What are some of the common challenges that you see running site reliability engineering in any organization, irrespective of the size of it? What are some of the key challenges that people struggle? And because our viewers will want to know about some of those common pitfalls that they can be well prepared to see that they can survive with that kind of eventualities.
Yeah, totally. So I think the biggest one is like organizations who I think see a need for SRE, but they basically just rebrand their ops organization into SRE. And then it's like, well, it's business as usual, but you all are called SRE now.
Right.
So it's really like, it's, you have to convince the folks who are doing the work that this is different type of work. And especially like it can be really hard, right? If you've been in operations your whole life and you're kind of like chilling with your job and like, you know the drill, like you have a good relationship with the system, like, its nuances. It can be really hard to, like go through that paradigm shift.
Sure.
And realize like, oh, there's actually a better way of doing this, and that I can actually codify a bunch of the stuff and then focus my efforts on way cooler things, like ways to secure the system, ways to make sure that I can monitor the system, focus on observability, that sort of thing. So there's that. And I think I think we need to also like make sure we need the education to educate the individual contributors, right. Who, especially if they are transitioning from an ops role to an SRE role. I think it's equally important if you're starting up like an SRE organization, like bring in like a seasoned SRE, right, who can show that team the ropes, so that you're not flying blindly, right? It's always nice to have somebody who's got some experience who can kind of guide you. And then also equally important, like the folks in the organization who deem that, yes, we need an SRE organization, but they're not properly educated on what it entails. And I think a lot of executives get like really enamored with like the shiny new thing, right? And it's like, oh, we need this because I read this somewhere or some consultant told me blah, but they're not really sure like how to go about it. So I think connecting with peers in the industry who have done that sort of thing before is also extremely helpful, right? Because then it'll guide them and give them some idea of like where to go, what things that they want to try, don't want to try. But the other thing to mention that I think is equally important, because a lot of people are always quoting like the Google SRE book as like the SRE Bible, and it has, some amazing ideas, but not every company is Google. Every company is different. So you kind of have to figure out what flavor of SRE works for you, right? I think take some of the core principles. So like making sure that you codify things, make sure that you focus on SLOs, error budgets, really making a reliability a priority. And on the error budgets, like, hey, if you're at the point where like you have zero error budget left, that's kind of a problem, because now you don't have time to focus on the reliability of the system, and that's a problem. So do not take like the SRE, the Google SRE book as like the only way to do SRE, because it's not a one size fits all.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you brought a lot of good points around aspects. And one thing which you highlighted make me resonate very well, because a lot of the leaders that I speak, senior executives, they come up with a conference, be it Gartner or Forrester, and they say, it's all the SRE way to build reliability. And the question is, what do you mean by that? So I get introduced to a lot of these expert talk sessions where we want to tell them, why the heck do you need SRE in the first place? Right? How are things going to change? Because in reality, the business leaders do not care a damn about whether it's DevOps or SRE or Lean. All they care about is profitable growth and more customer satisfaction and stuff. So the ability to articulate in the business language has been a perennial problem from an IT to business perspective. And just getting them onboarded on the why of SRE before we kind of get those. And it so happened in my last engagement, one of the clients, the customer asked me that, what's the value of it? And then I just asked him, what's the cost of downtime? I mean, looking at a status report is about $150,000 per hour. Then I said that, what if you sponsor 2 SREs and I can reduce your unplanned outages? How does it sound? And we got the business case approved for it. So
Yeah.
sometimes you need to ask the right questions and make the trigger for business to understand what value you bring to the table, rather than just looking at a glorified role called an SRE, which probably defeats the purpose, right? On how it can be manageable. So in terms of coming on to the aspect of observability, because you have been a strong proponent of observability and doing some work as a Cloud Native Computing Foundation ambassador. Now, what are you pretty much excited about the aspect of observability? And a lot of organizations that I'm seeing are still struggling from a monitoring standpoint. They're still trying to gauge about things. And there's some vendor out of the world, they come and tell them, we will bring you observability. So people are kind of confused and they are in crossroads and they are looking for help to see if observability will be the next magic wand. So what is your take on the observability aspect of it?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think like observability has the ability to really like give SREs an edge, right? Because who doesn't want to know why their system is acting all wonky? But right. You're right. I mean, there's a lot of overwhelming information around that, and there's like a lot of different camps on observability and definitions on observability, and I think also like we see a lot of like there are these old school monitoring companies who are like, well, we do observability too, right? Just like a rebrand, similar to what we've seen, the rebrand of ops into SRE. Right. And so not really taking into account like what is it about observability, and the idea is like you want to have that like holistic view of your system so that when I click a button to add something to cart and something goes wrong, I can figure out what exactly went wrong, right? And I think that's the main thing. And it like observability, it obviously benefits distributed systems quite a bit, because we are living in this world where some companies have thousands of microservices interacting with each other. You have no freaking clue, like sometimes what they're doing, right? Like it can be so unpredictable. So to be able to know, like, when you click a button to add something to cart, you can follow that little trail of all the things that happen when you click that button, I think is so cool. But we also need to remember that observability still benefits the monolith. So if you have a monolith, like ain't no shame, like you can still use observability and to also understand what's going on in your systems.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the part of the observability is changing gears around it. So one of the pioneers of the whole aspect, and it's getting a lot more promises these days, is the open telemetry. One of the things I got fascinated when people talked about open telemetry was the automatic instrumentation, which is again everybody's aha moment if there is an automatic instrumentation available in place. So what is your take on some of the tips on migrating to open telemetry? Is it a kind of a fad or a hype? Or is it saying there's still a merit on that? Because I know that you're very passionate about open telemetry, but in real sense, are organizations seeing real value out of open telemetry? And how does that, what are some of the tips to migrate towards open telemetry, considering there's a whole plethora of tools from a tool chain standpoint that they are managing as part of their pipelines? What would be your suggestions to move towards that space?
Yeah, totally. So I think the first things first, I think it's important to realize that because like OpenTelemetry has the backing of all the major observability vendors out there, it has become like the standard for instrumenting your code. And that's great news because now we're not having like these competing standards. I mean, we've had in the past like there were some attempts to standardize it previously with like open census and open tracing.
Right.
And those actually were merged to form OpenTelemetry. But then there's also like, there have been other ways that people have decided to instrument their code, like writing their own libraries. And that's all well and good, but isn't it nice to have some standardization in place so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel? Someone else is thinking about that.
Sure.
And so all you need to do is like instrument your code and send it somewhere. And that's what I love about OpenTelemetry is that it's vendor neutral.
Right.
So, you can, if you're working with vendor X and, they're doing it for you for now, but, after a while you're like, I don't know, like how I feel about these guys. I'm going to try a different vendor. You can basically configure it so that you send your instrumentation data to multiple vendors at the same time. So you can do like a little vendor bake off. So that you can see like, oh, well, this vendor like renders this data in this way, and this vendor renders the data in that way. So like the differentiating factor isn't how you instrument the code. It's more like, are they rendering this information in a way that you're able to query it and basically figure out what the heck is going on in your system if something is going wrong? So I think that's why I think like OpenTelemetry is here to stay, because it has like that backing. It's become like a standard. But migrating to OpenTelemetry can still be a challenge, right? Because a lot of organizations find themselves in situations where either they have zero instrumentation, in which case when you decide you're going to instrument your code, you're basically saying it in some ways it's like introducing technical debt, right? Because you have to go back and instrument like this old code that, I don't know, some people haven't touched it for years. But then you also have like the folks who have their code instrumented with like open tracing or open census, right? In which case, again, you have to go back and figure out like, so open tracing and open census are backward compatible to OpenTelemetry, which is great because then that means that initially, if you have your code instrumented that way, you can just send that data through to the OpenTelemetry collector, which is basically a vendor neutral agent, which will ingest the data, transform it to the OpenTelemetry format, and then send it to whatever backend. So that makes it a little bit easier. But like if you're instrumenting from scratch, it can be very challenging because you're like, well, where do I get started? So a couple of tips that I like to tell people is, first of all, look at the critical like services that people tend to hit. So if there's like one particular, service call that's like super common, like a lot of people add whatever item to cart. And it's something that for whatever reason has been like very troublesome in the past, you might want to look at instrumenting that entire flow, right? Because then that's something that's on your critical path. And so when you have that instrumentation in place, well, now next time something happens, you have that added visibility into things. The other thing that you want to consider is like, if you have any homegrown libraries or frameworks, look at instrumenting those. Because chances are like your code is going to be calling those a bunch. So if you instrument those, you probably have a bunch of coverage around instrumenting your code. And then the final thing that I like to tell folks is, if you've decided, like you've committed to using OpenTelemetry, as the saying goes, the best time to plant a tree is yesterday. The next best time is today. So start instrumenting like any new code that comes up, right? Get into that practice of instrument as you go. Keep in mind, like when you're instrumenting, like what are the things that are important to me? If I were to troubleshoot this thing in production, what's important? What should I call out? And then to your point on auto instrumentation, that's also another really great starting point because a lot of languages support auto instrumentation and OpenTelemetry. Unfortunately, not all, but I believe the ones right now are Python, .NET, Java, JavaScript, PHP. And then I think, and Go also has auto instrumentation, but it's done slightly differently. I believe the other languages, they have some sort of agent that basically It's like a wrapper around the code. I think Go is done a little bit differently, but those are great ways to start with instrumenting your code, because it's a no touch, situation where you can just implement the auto instrumentation. You don't have to go in and instrument your code, and you're already starting to see some telemetry coming in. The caution around that is that sometimes you end up over instrumenting your code, and then you're like, well, I don't necessarily need all this stuff. So you have to be really careful and not go instrumentation bonkers and instrument all the things, because it might just end up with information overload, and then it's no good to you.
Right. So the final question is about instrumentation itself, right? Because a lot of times, earlier world, we had this monitoring in place that we all understand that it's a monitoring myth that you cannot monitor everything in this part. So we get some blind spots. We call up the developer and says, can you please fix this out for this? We have no idea about why this happened and those things. So help us understand, what does instrumentation mean from a developer standpoint, and how is it going to help the operation folks to be better preemptive of certain things? Will it be that it is going to push it to error logs? So give us through a use case scenario of building an instrumentation, and what was earlier, and with instrumentation, how does it make that path very easy for people in that value chain?
Yeah, sure. So from an observability standpoint, when you instrument your code, I think the main thing you want to keep in mind is that traces are your first class citizen. Now the trace gives you that end-to-end view of your system, of like what happens across like system boundaries, right? So it's like, what happens when this microservice calls this one, or even like a function calling the same microservice. You get that like little breadcrumb. So when you're instrumenting your code, you want to make sure that you're basically creating traces. And in open telemetry, that means that you create spans. So the span is the building block of your trace. So a trace is made up of multiple spans. A span represents an operation. A trace is basically a tree of spans. So you can have like nested spans, right? One's in the same way that you have a function that calls a bunch of other functions, right? So it's basically that trail of the function. So that's, I think the main thing is like understanding like what kinds of traces do you want to create for your systems? That's number one. Now the traces help give you that overall picture, but it's also helpful to see like, we need some information, right? So in your spans, you can capture things like attributes. So like you get some common attributes with OpenTelemetry, like, your operation name and like what language it's instrumented in, but there's like some additional like custom attributes that you might want to capture. Like, for example, if you have a function that's spitting out like a list of available products for a particular user, maybe that's something that you want to capture as attributes. But then you might also want to capture like some messages, right? Like we've been relying on logs since the beginning of computing times. So one thing that you can do in as part of when you create a span is to create span events, which is basically like a structured log inside your span, which is super helpful because it tells you about things that happened at a particular point in time. So now we've got that additional contextual information. And on top of that, I mean, metrics still matter, right? Even though the trace is the first class citizen, we need to have our supporting actors, the logs and the metrics, because the metrics do they're useful in that we need them for SLOs, right? And they can be the trigger to like figure out like, there's a problem in our system. Where do we start looking in our system? So if we can tie our spans to our metrics as well, and OpenTelemetry has the ability to do that as well. It's got a thing called exemplars, which allows it to tie spans to metrics. And there's also some thing called like I think it's called the span connector. Can't remember exactly, but it's something along those lines where it takes like it basically converts like information from your spans into a metric, so it can like the start time, end time of the span, you can convert that into a metric of how long it took to complete that operation. So keeping those types of things in mind when instrumenting your code, I think are super important. Really like keeping in mind, like, what are the things that are important to me? Like when you're debugging your code as a developer, right? There are things as you're going along, oh, well, I don't have any information on this. I need to like add this print statement at that print statement. Think along those lines too when you're instrumenting your code, right? If I'm troubleshooting, what are the things that I need to see to be able to understand what's going on?
Yeah. Absolutely. I think it's been a delight. We can talk for hours to do that, but we are kind of coming to that final part of it. It's been an absolute a treasure of information that you've shared in such a short time. And particularly for a lot of viewers, the observability part and the level of instrumentation has been so valuable because they're kind of making that shift from where they are today, from looking at when you call it as reliability as a first-class citizen, you need to also look at distributed tracing. And tracing is a very important aspect of it. You did touch upon the whole part of it. And finally, SRE. How is the demand for SRE going to be? And if someone wants to make a career in SRE, is it the right place to be in? And what kind of skills and attributes you would suggest they should have to become a good SRE and do their work really well?
I mean, I think to be a good SRE, and as with any area in tech, be curious. Like be curious about like new technologies that help make our lives better. Always, and I think you have to be a little bit obsessive. Like, don't be satisfied with like, oh, this is good enough, right? Always strive to make it better and better. There's no such thing as done software, and I don't think we're ever going to be done when it comes to reliability. And I think having an affinity for coding always helps as well, because like as part of SRE, we want to codify all the things. I think really it's about making sure that we codify all the things and find new and interesting ways of making our systems reliable. So having like the curiosity, problem-solving aspect will get you very far as an SRE.
Thank you so much, Adriana, for this excellent session. And viewers, you hope that you had a great share of wisdom today about various aspects of site reliability engineering, open telemetry, and observability, because I think this is the thing that is happening around in this world. And I hope that by listening to these episodes and putting some of these learnings to actual actions, you will get a lot more benefits in your SRE journey and keep it coming. And thank you once again, Adriana, for sharing your wisdoms. And I hope people will find it useful. And how can they reach out to you if they have any questions or want to have a conversation about some of these aspects in a deeper manner? How can they reach out to you?
Oh, sure. I'm on pretty much all the socials. So you can find me on LinkedIn, and you can find me on X, i.e. Twitter, at Adriana M. Villela. So it's ADRIANA MVILLELA. And on Mastodon as well, same handle. And my server is hachyderm.io on Mastodon. And Instagram, same handle. You can find me there. Also have a podcast that discusses these topics as well, on SRE observability, all the techie things called Geeking Out. So you can definitely check out some of my content on there as well.
Absolutely. We'll put that on the comment section as we start to release that part. But it's been a great time, and I hope everything goes well for you in your journey. And we look forward to seeing you sometime somewhere in person. Thank you so much, Adriana.
Thanks so much for having me.